Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the next segment of our universal, or not, I shouldn't say universal, I should say various texts unit in 12th grade English. Now, last time we took a look at mythology, particularly the myths of Prometheus and the myths of Daedalus and Icarus. And this time we're going to move pretty dramatically away from fictional writing, even mythic writing, into nonfiction. We're going to take a look at a couple nonfiction passages. And I've kind of thrust us through time quite a bit here because we left off with like a passage from Ovid, during the first couple centuries AD. Now we're fast forwarding almost 2,000 years into the future, and we're going to be talking about the 20th century. We're going to be specifically talking about 20th century literature, nonfiction literature especially. And the passages that I've chosen are two particular works that I think are definitely on the must-read list for anybody in high school, for anyone who really kind of wants to get that full education of the humanities, of history, and even of English literature. One is the Gulag Archipelago from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And this particular work is extremely long. There's a very nice abbreviated version of it that I offer my students, as I think you remember from the intro to this course, a lot of extra credit points on. So if you want to do that for your independent reading project, really, really good choice because it's a really worthwhile thing to read, especially to study. You can learn a bit from it, and it's also just going to earn you a lot of points if you try to tackle it. Now, we'll talk about what the Gulag Archipelago is about soon enough, but then the other option of what we're going to be looking at here is man's search for meaning. This also is on that extra credit list. Okay, so we got two passages from these two very, very influential and very, very well-known works of the 20th century. Now, what I'd like to do in this particular lesson, when we get here, is not simply look at the passages and break down exactly what it was that they were, what they're doing, what their themes are, what elements they're using, and all this kind of stuff. I like to instead go back to something that we talked about both in the humanities course when we got to the 20th century history. We talked about this in Animal Farm in ninth grade. We talked about this when we read Lord of the Flies in 10th grade. And we talked a little bit about it in The Crucible when we were talking about the historical context around The Crucible, which is the history of the 20th century. And a particular part or a particular angle of that history. And that angle that we're going to be approaching or we're going to be discussing is the atrocities of the 20th century, and particularly the dysfunction of the 20th century. Just to give us some really strong context for the two works we were going to be reading, and for really anything that you're reading in the 20th century. Because I think if we understand the causes and of the dysfunction that occurred in the 20th century, a couple things are going to be useful for us. Are going to be worthwhile for us to. A couple things will be very useful to us if we do that. Number one, obviously, we're going to understand, generally the context and the ideas that are floating around for the authors of this particular period. But guys and gals, I think what might be tired to you now, but I think what is a really, really strong thing to remember is it's useful for us to look at this particular period of history and try to understand what it was that happened and why it happened, and thus come away with some things that we might want to avoid, that we might want to really, really be aware of as we move into through the 21st century and even into the 22nd century. Okay, so I'm going to go through this, and we're going to highlight maybe two or three really big takeaways from the 20th century that, like we've been saying for a while, is something that is very applicable to our real lives, both on a political level, on a global level, and also on a personal level. If you can identify some of the main lessons of history from this period, I think you and your countries and the world will be better for it. Okay, so let's do that now. So the 20th century, I like to begin, of course, like as you should with a big story like this, I like to begin a little bit before the century actually begins, so the late 1800s and then into the early 1900s. I've listed out here maybe 4 distinct historical features or movements or just kind of things that were happening, things that were kind of moving forward in history during this period before the century really begins. And the first one is, of course, scientific and technological advancements. There was, of course, an explosion of the Industrial Revolution. There was an explosion of factory productions, and there was an enormous move towards cities, and which caused, of course, the increase of populations, and a lot of serious developments in the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, etc. And as a result, humanity began what is essentially described as kind of like a really sharp curve, an exponential curve upwards in its advancement and its technological capabilities. And this is the beginning of that, okay? We saw little, glimpses of it, or kind of like, warnings that this was going to happen in the 1700s, but now it's really starting to actually move quite quickly. And so this, of course, includes a lot of very wonderful, especially medical advancements, a lot of technological innovation and scientific innovation that is extremely helpful, okay, particularly in making lives less full of suffering and making our lives, in some sense, easier. However, of course, this also comes with the industrialization of warfare, with the increased production of weaponry. And that's going to reach, I think, its pinnacle in about the 1960s, which we'll talk about soon. So this is happening. The second feature that I point out here, the late 1800s, is the development or the kind of emergence of what we would call Marxist communism. So those of us who followed me in, or followed our course, I should say, in ninth grade, looking at Animal Farm, will remember a relatively detailed discussion of Marxism and George Orwell's critique of it, at least in the form that the Soviet Union was trying to implement in that text. And the same can be kind of applied here. So if you want a really detailed look at that, go check out the video on Animal Farm, the preview video of Animal Farm especially. But Marxism begins to emerge. Now, there were forms of communism already kind of like, emerging at the time. Marx and his good friends, Engels, really kind of brought it forward into the public light and created a brand of it, you could say, that made this economic and political philosophy much more widely read and much more attractive to a lot of people. Well, what are the basic tenets of this ideology, this belief system? Because I think you can qualify it as a belief system, as sort of a pseudo political religion of some kind. Number one is the lens that it views history through. And we've kind of talked about this, at least in passing, with our lenses, right? With our discussion of how do we interpret literature. Well, the first point is in regards to the struggles of history. Marxism believes that all of history is essentially a struggle that people are going through continuously to try to gain more and more capital and more power or influence. And they are struggling against an upper class or an elite class, an elite group of people that is effectively holding them down or kind of keeping them at bay, with the desire to kind of keep the money or keep the power that they have accumulated. And this is the tension that we've been going through in history. as humanity gets larger in its population, as it gets more developed in its intellect and in its cultures and all this kind of stuff, we see that that gap slowly starts to close between the rich and the poor. And Marx believed that very soon now, because of the advent of the Industrial Revolution and the now ease at which we can produce materials for our own needs, he believed that we would soon be reaching a point in history where we no longer need to really compete very much for economic wealth, economic means, and that we could essentially just reach an equivocal state where we are all able to get everything we need and live in harmony with each other and not need to be struggling and kind of fighting to be on top or fighting against these, upper class sort of people or billionaires or whatever you want to call it that might be holding more money and holding us down. Okay. Now, he also said that in order to do this, most likely those systems, those beliefs of the past, mainly capitalism and these beliefs in competition and all this other kind of stuff, are going to need to be removed. Are going to need to be overthrown in some way, shape, or form. Now, this is where we get to the controversial bits, because I think my colleagues and my students know quite well that I'm very, very critical and very, very weary of Marx and Marxism. I think there's a very strong case to be made that Marxism as a philosophy is, at the very least, deeply, deeply flawed, and at the very worst, outright evil because of what it has effectively led to and what it effectively does in the century. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more. But in this particular note, the reason I bring it up now is because I think there are clear passages in Marx's writing where he does call for the quote unquote overthrowing of regimes, of people, of classes, of all this kind of stuff. Of course, he's talking about the rich, he's talking about the wealthy, he's talking about the upper class and all this kind of stuff. Now, does Karl Marx mean that needs to be done in violence, that needs to be done violently, like we will soon see in history? He doesn't specify. Now, I take it as a general rule of political philosophies. If you're calling for a revolution and you are not explicitly saying that it needs to be an ideological revolution / a peaceful revolution, you are therefore calling for violence. I think that's generally how these political movements work. We're going to see the same thing in communist Russia. We're going to see the same thing in communist China. And we're going to see the same thing in Germany as well before the Nazis take over. These groups, these governments were overthrown or at least deeply affected by groups that were calling for revolutions of some kind. And they did not outright say that they were going to be violent, nor did they outright say, or even kind of subtly suggest that they were going to be peaceful. All right. So I think Marx has a little bit to answer for here. And there's a little bit more that he has to answer for, but we'll get there in a minute. Now, religion is another interesting point that this particular philosophy has a problem with. Karl Marx, along with many scientists at the time, along with many cultural figures of the time, along with many philosophers of the time, has a deep problem with religion. This is a period of history that is, just at the end of the Enlightenment, where we've slowly started trying to move away from the influence of religion on the Western world, on Western civilization. Of course, the dominant religion of the Western world has been Catholicism / Christianity. And since the medieval era, since kind of the end of the medieval era, that has slowly kind of been a game that we've been playing where we've been trying to move further and further away from strict religious traditions or strict religious teachings and religious morals. And so what you see in Marx is a characterization of religion as just a tool. He sees it as another tool that the upper class are using to control us. and are using to subjugate us and keep us down. That's all he thinks religion is. He thinks it's effectively it's useless. He thinks it's effectively something that is worthless and not holding any validity or truth to it. And so Marxism as a philosophy is deeply atheistic and even, I would say, anti-religious. It's not simply content with being secular. It wants to actually remove religion and be deeply cynical and skeptical of religion. So that's happening. Okay, so this philosophy is emerging as the technology is emerging as well. On top of this, like we were just saying, we have more and more movements, more and more thinkers that are pushing or are really leaning into this anti-religious, anti-traditional way of thinking and looking at the world. We know that Charles Darwin emerged around this time. We know that he, of course, posits and kind of puts forward the theory of evolution, of biological evolution. And there's a mixed reaction to this. Many people who were already kind of, afraid of what religion was, religion standing in society, with the incoming sciences and the conflicts over the cosmology and all this other kind of stuff, saw Darwin as a huge threat to religion. Whereas the majority of religious people, minus the American South, saw it as like, whatever, this is just some new insight we're getting into the biological world, into the creation of God. Sure, sure, sure. But a lot of people also saw it as essentially a way to explain humanity's existence that is an alternative to religion. Fundamentally, they interpreted it, these kind of more atheistic, more secular thinkers interpreted Darwin's ideas as revealing to us that we are no longer special. We are no longer, sort of some pinnacle of creation. We're not special. We're just kind of like a random production of evolution. Whereas the more religious worldview, would want to say, no, we're not random. This was ordered by a more moral and divine sort of source. Okay, well, alongside that comes a figure like Friedrich Nietzsche and Karl Marx. And, we could go down the list, of all these other very existential sort of philosophers and thinkers and people who are just deeply skeptical of religion. So there's this serious strain. I think the largest movement away from religion and religious thoughts that we've seen since, since ever, really. Since the dominion of Christianity, since the Roman Empire. And what the danger in that is, or what one of the points that a lot of people kind of worry about in a movement like that, is what's now going to come about with regards to morality. And this is something that Friedrich Nietzsche brings up. And we talked about this, again, if you followed us in 11th grade when we talked about Macbeth, this is something we talked about pretty explicitly, which is when you remove God from the equation, when you remove all of our traditional beliefs that Christianity has really helped us understand and Judaism has helped us understand with regard to morality, and then let's say you remove that tradition now, what happens to the morality? Well, Nietzsche is extremely pessimistic. He says it's going to change. It's going to become very, very new and very, very different and maybe even horrible at times. And a lot of other thinkers are kind of skeptical about that. But Nietzsche was really dramatic about this. And I want us to hold on to this point, because remember back to what we just read about 2 sections ago in the New Testament and the Old Testament, which effectively just is a quick summary of what Christian ethics fundamentally says about human beings. It says that we are infinitely valuable, irrespective of what? Our class, our race, our sex, our sexuality, all this other kind of stuff. And it says that human beings are all equal in value. Well, that again is a relatively unique idea in the span of human history up until that point. And what happens when we remove the system that, or we at least strongly try to move away from the system that teaches something like that? Well, let's wait and see, okay? Because I think there is a clear connection between this sort of cultural movement and then what we're going to see in the 20th century. And then finally, of course, really quickly, we have nationalism, which is the deep and kind of pervasive and consistent love of someone's country, but to the point where it is not just a love, but it is a almost hyperfixation and hyperinflation of the importance of one's country, maybe to the point of supremacy, okay, of saying that our nation or our country or our land is the greatest ever and therefore has certain rights that the other ones do not. Okay, so nationalism is very much on the rise as the 1800s come to a close and the 1900s begin to open up as well. Okay, all of this now, all four of these produce what I have called this belief in what we would call the advancement of history, with this idea that history is really just an upward progression, right? We're getting better and better and better and better. Well, of course, then, what is that leading to? Well, it's, of course, leading to a utopian-like situation, that we're getting so much better, we're advancing so much that we are eventually going to get to a state where we have the means to create effectively a utopia, and we have improved ourselves so much that we're going to effectively create the greatest civilization the world has ever seen. And we're going to then kind of reach a blissful stasis where we can kind of live in peace forever. That's very much what Marxism is kind of aiming for. Now, you don't have to be a Marxist to believe in this, as we're going to see, but it just kind of peppered culture and peppered a lot of people's thoughts with this idea that, yes, the best is yet to come, okay? The great realm is coming, right? The great, the great realm or the great commune, okay? Now, why do I use those terms, realm and commune? Well, commune, pretty obvious, right? We're kind of very clearly linking back to Marx, but the term realm, of course, is the word I'm using that word because of its German translation, the Reich, right? A new realm or a new Germany or a new, supremacist state. Okay, so this idea, the idea that we are coming to a utopia, we're coming to a final point of history, is something to very much take note of. Shortly thereafter, two major things happen. Number one, we have the communist revolution in Russia, okay, which again, we covered quite a bit and we looked at Animal Farm. And then we have the outbreak shortly thereafter, or kind of around the same period, of World War I. Okay, World War I, really quickly, don't need to go into much detail about it, except for the fact that it was absolutely catastrophic to the population of Europe, particularly the male population. And it was also catastrophic to the culture of Europe as well, because it injected an incredible amount of cynicism and an incredible amount of distrust of the major institutions of Europe at the time, mainly the government and the church. It made people really not trust authority very much at all, because of course those groups of authorities were telling us in Europe at the time, this war is going to be over quickly. It's going to be glorious. It's going to be simple. We'll be home by Christmas, all this kind of stuff. Of course, fast forward 4+ years later, you're, either stuck in a trench, suffering immensely after several of your friends have died, or you are, severely injured and in the hospital permanently, or at least injured permanently in some way, shape, or form, or you're dead. And that does quite a bit to the psyche of the population of Europe. And some people argue that Europe to this day has not recovered from that, from this just immense failure of the systems of power in Europe, and how they basically threw their young men into this absolutely pointless war that was effectively only happening because people were really, really leaning into a lot of nationalism and the desire for expansion of borders. And on top of it, we were just not prepared for the emergence of technology into warfare with the kind of new abilities that these weapons would, these weapons of war, like, whether it be guns, whether it be kind of early forms of turrets and all this other kind of stuff, would effectively force us into trench warfare and a horrible situation. The weapons of World War II were not made or seen yet, so it's still pretty bad, right? So if again, it's kind of like if you think this is bad, just wait for World War II to break out. Okay, so that happens. Meanwhile, you have this revolution in Russia, where the Tsar, the monarchy, which had been, hundreds of years established, was overturned very violently. And the revolution called for a couple of different things. Number one, no more religion, no more of the Tsar's religion, okay, the Orthodox Church. Get it out of here. No more, or no more, brother. But we need unity. We need unity between all Russians, all workers, all this kind of stuff. However, we need no more elites. Okay, no more of the upper class. If you remember from the story of Animal Farm, no more humans, right? No more of the czars, upper class sort of people, and no more classes overall. We cannot have any of these class distinctions. All of us must be equal in this new communist regime. This, of course, was headed up by Vladimir Lenin and his then lackey, soon to be, successor, Joseph Stalin. Okay, so how does that go? Does that go well? Not if you are in any of those groups listed above. If you are a part of the Tsar's regime, you're dead. If you are part of the Tsar's family, you are dead. If you are someone in that upper class regime, you are very much likely going to be dead if you do not flee. If you are someone who owns property, as you're going to see, you are dead. If you are someone of a political class or of a group that is sharply opposed to Lenin or Marxism or any of this kind of stuff, but not necessarily, in favor of the Tsar either, you're dead. Okay. Now, yes, this happens in the early 1900s, but the regime, the communist regime, at least under Stalin and under under Stalin, goes up until the 50s, up until like about 1950 something, when Stalin dies in 1954 or something like that. And then the communist regime kind of like, stays around for a couple more decades and then just fizzles out and it fails economically, which is no small thing, by the way. But in the meantime, let's talk about this for a minute. What happened in communist Russia under Stalin and Lenin's rule? 50 million civilians, ladies and gentlemen, 50 million men, women, and children died. Okay. And I use the term murdered usually pretty specifically. I would use that here. Stalin and Lenin and their government, their communist Russian government, murdered 50 million civilians. How so? Either through starvation. Okay, this is why, by the way, you end up seeing numbers very, very kind of fluctuating. Some people say, no, Stalin only killed, about 20 million. Some people say, no, it's more like, 30 million. I usually settle on the 50 million because if you accumulate all the people who were not active soldiers, but who died in their systems, in their prison camps, and as a result of their policies, I think those all accumulate up to about 50 million. And that includes starvation, right? There were 10 million people who starved to death in the Ukraine under Stalin's policies alone, right? And, we could spend an entire several hours talking about that. Like, what does that look like? What does that entail? It's grotesque. There's laws that say stop eating your children, like all this kind of horrific stuff. There's direct executions, right? Sometimes we didn't get to the point of starvation. Sometimes you don't get to the point of imprisonment or slave labor. We just shoot you, okay? We just take you into one of the government buildings in Moscow and we just shoot you, okay? And sometimes it's torture, right? We will just kind of keep you in that cell, torture you through all sorts of really fun and creative means until you just die and succumb of your injuries and succumb from the stress. Or we're going to put you in a labor camp called a gulag, by the way, where we were going to work you essentially meaninglessly to death. Okay. And out there, out there in the cold, Siberian tundras of the gulag, you'll just die there. Who were the people who died? What groups were targeted here? Number one, landowners. Okay. The kulaks, right? Business owners, right? Anyone who was seen to have capital, anyone who was seen as someone of the upper class or of the quote unquote middle class, These people were removed from society and mostly killed. Okay, right off the bat, that is under Lenin, right? There was a whole weird movement, I think, about 7 or 8 years ago of people questioning, was Lenin really that bad? Was he really that bad? Wasn't he just a revolutionary? No, guys, he actively sought for execution of people. He actively was promoting these policies. Okay. If you were one of those, dead. If you were an academic who did not support Marxism, dead. So me, I'm out of there. I'm dead real quick. If you were part of the royalty, like we said, dead. If you were part of the church or even affiliated with the church, dead. If you were a traveler, if you were someone who traveled to the Western world and experienced capitalism, you were suspect to imprisonment and torture and death then. If you were a prisoner of war, please notice this as the next point, articulates, a soldier or a prisoner of war, meaning if you were captured by, let's say, the German army in World War II, and you were then released and brought back to Russia, you were put in prison because you had been exposed to non-Marxist or anti-Marxist groups, and you therefore were put in prison and tortured and probably killed as a result. If you were a soldier who just fought in Germany, who fought against the West, you were probably put in jail because you were suspect of having been exposed to an alternative form of operation that wasn't Marxist, okay? If you were unenthusiastic about the new regime and about communism, you were put in jail, right? Because of course you're suspect of being a traitor, okay, of being someone who's subverting the system. If you were a critic in any way, shape, or form, you had to go. If you were protesting anything at all, you had to go. In other words, if you were suspect in any way, shape, or form, if someone in your family was suspect in any way, shape, or form, if you spoke to or were affiliated or were associated with anyone who was suspect in any way, shape, or form, you were liable to incarceration, torture, and death. Okay. This is, of course, where we get these obscene numbers from in the great terror that is Stalin's regime. There was no one that was safe under Stalin. The comedy, even though it's a dark comedy movie, The Death of Stalin really kind of shows this quite well. So, go check that out. It's a really dark movie, but it kind of shows the absurdity of this system. Okay. So this is happening. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, after and around, kind of the end of World War II, we have the emergence of communism in China under Mao Zedong. And he implements what he calls the Great Leap Forward, and of course, the Cultural Revolution. And guys and gals, if you thought Stalin was bad, what ends up happening in communist China? You have over 70 million civilians outright executed, tortured, etc., or starved to death. Millions upon millions of people died under Mao's attempt to revolutionize the industrial systems and the general social systems of China, which we don't talk about in education very much. We don't usually focus on this. And there's a whole discussion as to why, but I don't really want to get into that too much here as to why we don't talk about it that much. I might touch on it at the end here, but not a huge deal. But suffice to say, we know it now, okay? We know about these atrocities now. And what do we now think about this? We look at two major world powers that try to enact Marxist communist systems, and how does it go? It goes atrociously. We see that, number one, these systems cannot actually economically survive, right? The communist China effectively had to be communist now to this day only in name. It has enacted and injected capitalist principles very clearly. And when it comes to communist Russia, it collapsed. The economic system absolutely collapsed. And the same can be said for effectively any communist system that we have seen since the beginning of the 1900s. It has either become a state of overt tyranny and I shouldn't say genocide, but I should say mass murder, as we saw with these two, or it is just economically nowhere near the might and the power of like capitalist systems, right? This is a non-controversial statement, by the way. I love the controversy around the the economic failures of China, or of communism in general. It just doesn't work, ladies and gents. It does not work as an economic system. And when we have students or academics or people to this day still saying, well, we haven't tried it yet. Well, we haven't tried real Marxism. We haven't tried it yet. We have to, of course, question, like, well, if you have this system that is Marxism and you inject it into test subjects, shall we say, countries, right? And everyone fails. Is it the country's fault? Is it the people's fault? Or is it the system's fault? Is it the system that we're injecting into these different countries that's not working? I think that you could say both, but it's very clearly, I think, also something wrong with the philosophy. Something about Marxism just does not work. And again, we talked about that in ninth grade, but suffice it to say, it doesn't work. And look at what it has led to in the 20th century. And contemplate this just alone. We have over 100 million people dead, not from war, but from overt, or at least passive death that has been inflicted on them by their governments. So when we look at the great murderers of history, the great murderous systems and beliefs of history, a lot of people usually like to point at religion and kind of will have this talking point where they say, oh, religion has led to more deaths than anyone in history, where we know statistically, guys, that is just not true. The vast majority of deaths in history, in warfare at least, come from just the general kind of movement of warfare, and it's the results of either demagogues or at least the desire for land and all this kind of stuff. It's got very little to do with religion. Whereas when we look at just belief systems that have led to and philosophies, political philosophies that have led to murders and deaths, communism stands head and shoulders above all of them, right? It's been just absolutely this bloody and evil, catastrophic system. And again, that is not a very controversial statement, I think, whether you're, very left-leaning or you're very right-leaning. I think everyone kind of recognizes, or at least should recognize if they're looking at the basic facts of history, that this system just does not work. Okay, so this happens in the 20th century. Sure. Inside these events is where we get the Gulag Archipelago published. Alexander Solzhenitsyn publishes this work, and it very much is attributed with one of the major factors that bring down communist Russia. It really just stabs the credibility of this country and this system through the heart in many ways. And we're going to talk about that once we get it. But just know, inside that whole sequence of atrocities is where Alexander Solzhenitsyn is writing. Okay, now, after World War I, what starts to happen? So while all this is going on in Russia, we then turn our attention to Germany and Europe, okay? And most of us, again, know where this is going and know what is going to go on here. I still want to kind of discuss it and just kind of revisit it so we have a clear understanding of it. Germany loses World War I. They were one of the agitators of the war, and they're punished for it, okay? Treaty of Versailles punishes them pretty severely. Why is this significant? Number one, because Germany was the cultural, I think, heavyweight of Europe at the time. Some people say, it was the greatest country in Europe. Debate what great means, whatever. But it was definitely the most advanced in terms of culture and technology at the time. Okay, so you got to kind of think of what that does to German nationalism, right? We view ourselves as very clearly the leaders of Europe in many ways, and then we go through this war and we lose, and not only do we lose, but we are now punished. We are made into a penalized state where we are basically having to pay an absurd amount of money in reparations to the other countries in Europe. What does this do to a nation's psychology, a nation's culture? It, of course, produces an immense amount of resentment. And it looks for a reason. It looks for reasons. Why did we lose this war? Why is it that we are in this situation now when we were in such a better situation earlier? How did this happen? Of course, we look for scapegoats. We look for people and events and other things to blame. Well, we could blame German leaders. We could blame the might of other, countries. We can blame a lot of different things. Of course, amidst these voices, Amidst the discussion and the resentment of what happened in World War One, there, of course, is a not entirely quiet, but relatively small group in Europe, or at least in Germany, that is discussing how the reason Germany is being held back, the reason why we are suffering so much is because there is a systemic group of people who are oppressing us, who are kind of really hindering us, at the very least economically, if not culturally, and perhaps even biologically. Now, what group are we talking about? Of course, we are, of course, talking not only about any, sort of external groups that might have been infiltrating Germany, but we are, of course, talking about a group that is within Germany that might be, relatively un-German in some way, but kind of foreign to German ideals and German philosophy. We are, of course, talking about the Jews. Okay. Now, what I have just laid out there, please don't like take that and run with it and say, oh, Mr. G 2020, 2024. No, that is the line of arguments and the line of supposed rationale that the Nazis were going to be using. So, of course, we have figures like Hitler kind of espousing these sort of things, okay? And then the groups that kind of, circulated Hitler at the time. Now, Hitler, of course, is saying all of this. He's getting a lot of it, by the way, from guys like Dietrich Eckart and all these other kind of pseudo-intellectuals that think that these are, solid ideas. And if you want to have more history about that, by the way, in Hitler's general rise to power and the details of his rise to power, I would encourage you to watch the Netflix documentary, Hitler's Circle of Evil. It does a really good job kind of summarizing all of these events. Well, Hitler, tries to seize party with his Nazi party. They don't do well the first time. He actually gets put in jail, a comfortable jail, but jail nonetheless. And he gets out. He publishes Mein Kampf. He publishes all these other works, kind of really emphatically showing why it's the Jews that need to be blamed for this. It's all the other racial minority groups. He talks about Germans, biological advancement, all these ideas, which, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, were circulating in academia. This is not like Hitler kind of grabbed these ideas out of nowhere. He grabbed them out of the schools and colleges of the time, which were pushing racist ideas, these ideas of racial, biological supremacy and advancement, which we have to say, unfortunately, has its roots in false, but absolutely clear connection with Darwinism, okay? With social Darwinism, right? The idea that Darwin's evolution of the species, isn't limited to just kind of simple finches and birds and whales and all this kind of stuff. It's also limited to human beings. It's also, extends to human beings, where some humans, these people believed, some humans are more advanced than others, are more developed than others, are more human than other humans, right? And thus we get this idea of racial and biological supremacy, this deeply, capital R, racist idea, okay? Hitler's spouting all this. Germany is like, yeah, okay, sure, whatever. And they've heard it in schools, they've heard it in academia, but slowly what starts to happen is Hitler also starts to predict the future instability of the world. And he predicts correctly the Great Depression, which does happen, which causes an immense amount of chaos and gives him the fertile ground he needs to step up and say, hey, we can provide some stability, which he does. He takes power afterwards. People sort of think that Hitler has a little more credibility to him. I think he gets something like 1/3 of the vote or something like that. He gets the majority vote and he becomes the chancellor and soon supreme chancellor of Germany. And thus the Nazi party begins to dominate the German people. Now, what is the Nazi party characterized by? We haven't talked about Nazis, directly. We've been focusing on the communism ideas. Well, Nazism fundamentally is a fascist belief system. It's a fascist government. So it has two kind of forms here. The idea of centralized government and the idea of hyper-nationalism, okay? So this idea in intense nationalism that we, really are the supreme focus. All of our focuses, all of our values need to be centered primarily on Germany first. Germany needs to be the utmost end of all things, okay, the preservation and the exaltation of Germany to the diminishment of all other countries, okay? That is hyper-nationalism, utmost loyalty to Deutschland, to the fatherland, okay? And centralized government, the idea that we need to focus the power on our government. We need to give all of the power to the government into one single figure, which of course is our dictator, Hitler. Okay. Of course, underneath it is also the ideas of expansion, right? The idea that we do need to expand, and we have the right to expand our borders because, of course, if we look back through history, we could say, oh, German borders actually included this country and actually include this country, and we keep going back and forth, and saying, actually, we deserve more land around us because we would be, better rulers, better stewards of this particular area. Now, that very clearly, ladies and gents, is going to lead to war. Now, as if that weren't bad enough, what is also kind of the ideology undergirding all of this? It is, of course, this idea of racial supremacy. It is all those racist ideas and all that fermented resentment towards the Jews and towards other racial groups that are not German and Aryan. Okay. What does that lead to? Before we even get to World War II, before we get to that whole catastrophe, we get what we know as the Holocaust. I prefer to use the word Shoah, which is the Jewish term for it, right? The catastrophe, the annihilation, right, of the Jewish people. It's not just the Jews, of course. There were 6 million Jews that were murdered in the Holocaust, but there were also 4 million other groups, or 4 million people who kind of belonged to other groups and were targeted by the Nazis as well. How were these people killed? They were killed by first the direct execution through gunfire, through hanging, through gassing, of course. They were killed through forced labor. They were used as slaves for slave labor, sometimes pointlessly, just for the points, or just for the desire to kind of make them work to death, right? They were given meaningless tasks to do, just to kill them quicker, or to kill them slower, I should say. And of course, they were tortured to death as well in that form. And who was it that was targeted? It was the disabled. Okay, that was one of the first groups that were targeted, that were taken away and killed through direct euthanasia at times, and then through direct murder. Sometimes it was, of course, more overt than that. It was the Jews, right? If you were Jewish, you were kind of, you had your rights taken away, and you were put in ghettos, and then you were put in concentration camps, and then killed thereafter. The Roma, right, the gypsy groups, religious dissidents, religious people who were not in favor of the Nazi Party, they were targeted as well. So Catholics, for example, conspirators, right, people who were accused of conspiring against Hitler and the Nazi Party, they were targeted. Gays, people who were kind of practicing homosexuality, or at least were suspects of being homosexuals, they were targeted and put into death camps as well. Polish people, particularly prisoners of war, and civilians were targeted. I think it's Russians down here. Yep, so Russians who were captured during the war, those were killed as well, and blacks were killed as well. Okay, so how does this happen? And I've actually given a direct recipe here, because I think this recipe could also be applied to what we saw in the communist states to some degree as well. Number one, we need to have the resentment of a group in the air, in the culture. We need to ferment the hatred and the blame of a particular group. That needs to be very clearly there, but also either in tangent with it or explicitly the dehumanization of that other group. So for example, if you are a communist, will be very likely to, if not overtly, resent the rich and the upper class and anti-communists, but you will sometimes be very tempted to dehumanize them. And this is something we see very clearly in Marx, talking about the fact that these people are so warped in their perception. The rich are so warped in their perception. They're so, feeble in their minds. They're so locked into a system that they can't even recognize that they're in that system. And they therefore are, in some sense, subhuman. They're in some sense less human than we enlightened, educated Marxists are. And the same thing is said in Nazi Germany, right? It's the idea that it's a very overt idea that, because of biology, because of, racial genetics and IQ and all this kind of stuff, that the Jews are obviously subhuman, are obviously actually like a different breed of human being. They have blood that we don't want to be mixing with German genes, okay? So that's a factor. Then victimization, right? So the idea that we as Germans have been victims of this systemic oppression, the idea that we as the working people of Russia have been the victims of mistreatment and subjugation under an unfair economic system, that is a very important piece in this recipe as well, this recipe for mass murder. That wasn't clear, by the way. Then we also need, of course, legal and cultural segregation and restrictions. We need to ferment more and more and more division to the point of clear division legally between groups, okay? That needs to be a point. And that's what was happening in Germany very clearly, and what happened really, really quickly in communist Russia. Now, we, of course, then need, this was much, much quicker in communist Russia, but it was a little bit slower, but very, very visible in Nazi Germany, which is the erosion of rights for those people who we, of course, see as subhuman in some way, shape, or form. These people cannot understand, or these people do not wish to understand, or they just, they're just not even people in some regard, in some sense, right? It's very rarely stated that clearly, but that's kind of how it, not kind of, but that's overtly kind of how it will sound at the end of the day. So we erode their rights very, very slowly, sometimes not so slowly, like with communist Russia, and we take away their rights to sometimes get married, sometimes reproduce, right? Sometimes have a business, own a business, work in a job, practice whatever they needed to practice, be in certain areas of society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we move into direct imprisonment, right? Because the easiest thing that these systems were able to do is just say, oh, these groups are resisting us. Some of these people are resisting us. They're trying to overthrow the government. We need to imprison them. They are a threat to us. Okay, so all of this will then lead to that point where we get people in prison, right? We have you in our grasp. And now what can we do with you as the government? We can kill you if we want. And we can, cover it up or kind of, gloss over it in any way, shape, or form that we can. And that's effectively what both of these groups do. They commit mass murder at scales you and I just cannot comprehend, okay? We can't comprehend what 1 million people are, let alone 10 million, 50 million, 70 million. But all of this happens, okay? And in that atrocity, by the way, in Germany is where we see Viktor Frankl writing his Man's Search for Meaning, struggling against, suffering and nihilism that he was obviously, tempted with and experiencing in this system. Okay. Now, as if all that, wasn't bad enough, what do we got now? We have the Nazi Party obviously pushing us further and further, and then eventually into World War II. Now, what does World War II basically result in? Okay, it's this, 6 or so years long war between the axis of evil, as we call them, right? Germany, Italy, and Imperial Japan. And then we have them, the Allied powers, America, Britain, and begrudgingly Russia, okay? Now, what's the fallout of this particular war? 3 things. Massive deaths on the battlefields, millions upon millions of people dead on all sides, okay? Because, of course, remember the industrial and the population explosion of the time that we were, inventing new weapons to kill our enemies with at much, much higher rates. And unfortunately, now we have the reemergence of something we would see, in ancient days, which is the targeting of civilians in warfare. Except now we're doing it with more deadly weapons. So no one was safe in these wars. It wasn't just kind of what we had seen in the past 100 or so years, where a couple 100 years where we would go out and we would have you and I, fighting with guns. Now it wasn't that. It was me trying to kill not just you with your gun, but also your family behind you and your friends behind you. I got to kill all of you, right? And I'm targeting them. Why? Lots of different reasons why, but it was happening, right? And of course, both sides engaged in this. Now, I think it's fair to say, why did we engage in this? Because the argument goes that we need to break the other side's morale as quickly as possible. We need to end this war as quickly as possible, because what is it that you are doing? You are trying to kill me, my friends, my women, my children, and all these sort of things. I am going to do whatever I can to stop that from happening in order to defend the innocent people behind me. And if that includes killing your people, who at the very least are or at some level at least are supporting you, that might kind of slow things down quickly enough for me to actually defeat you. That's the argument. Welcome to the debate there. If you think that that is immoral, I welcome that debate. I want that to play out among people, because that is still a very live issue to this day, as to whether or not America engaged in just war crimes or unjust war crimes in World War II. Is this good? Is this evil? Is this justified? Is this ever justified? What would it have cost if we had not done it? What does it cost us since we have done it? Have that debate. Okay, very, very good debate to have for a while, right? And of course, what is also happening behind the scenes, even if that wasn't bad enough, the behavior of people on the battlefield was not bad enough. We have behind enemy lines, right? Behind the scenes, we also have mass murder happening in communist Russia, in Nazi Germany, and also in Imperial Japan to some degree, okay? And of course, the war ends with the defeat of Germany and the emergence of the nuclear bomb, okay, or the atomic bomb at the time, and it develops into the nuclear bomb. And we then have the threat of nuclear war. We can talk, again, have the whole debate about whether or not we should have dropped the bomb, have the debate about, Oppenheimer inventing the bomb. Everybody was trying to invent the bomb at the time. Oppenheimer kind of just got there first, but the war ends. Russia now has the ability to create nuclear bombs. And then we have the arms race, where these bombs get bigger and bigger and bigger, so that what was done in Hiroshima and Nagasaki looks like, trivial compared to what we can do now. And we have the threat now emerging out of the first half of the 20th century of potential global and human annihilation, right, of our entire species and our world, which up until this point in history had never been a possibility, that we could actually fight each other with such grand weapons that we would actually kill the entire civilization, our entire species. That, of course, is where we end our story of the 20th century. So take a look at this. This whole crap show of the 20th century. What can we walk away with? What are some things we should walk away with as students, as human beings, that could at least show us, maybe we should kind of be wary of this. Maybe we should not engage in this or that. I think we can go back here and see some of the roots and see some of the problems. I think you can have your debate about Marxism, you can have your debate about Nazism, all this kind of stuff. But I think one of the roots, there's maybe two major roots that really kind of fermented those ideas that we need to be aware of. Number one is this idea of utopia. This idea that we as human beings can overtly override and overcome our nature, which has been with us for over 10,000 plus years. And we can somehow overcome all of our flaws, all of our weakness, all of our ignorance, and all of our malice, and we can somehow create this sort of perfect world. And if it's just so much, no matter what we do, we can kind of, we will get there. And we can justify all the things we need to do in between, just so we can kind of create this perfect world. This idea, this instinct towards utopia, And this ignoring of human nature is very dangerous, ladies and gentlemen. And I think that is one of the major lessons. If you remember, we did talk about this with Lord of the Flies, right? Lord of the Flies emerges after all of this happens. So I think William Golding very clearly was talking about this when he was illustrating to us the nature that humans have within them for immense evil and violence and dysfunction, right? All the weaknesses of humanity are laid bare in this particular story. And I think that is meant to be a direct counter to this idea of intense optimistic humanism and progressivism that says that we're going to be able to kind of usher in this perfect utopia or perfect realm or perfect world. I think that's false. I think that that's very, very dangerous, actually, to be perpetrating that. Okay. That's one problem. The other one is surrounding, again, the debate about religion. Debate what you want about religion. Is it true? Is it not? Is it true to some degree? True to some other degree? Which religion is true? Have that debate, but be very careful of this idea of removing the dignity of human beings, removing the value, or as we said down here, the rights of human beings. You need to be very careful about that. As soon as you start to say that you have more rights or have more value than other people inherently because of some immutable feature like your race or your intellect or something like that, you are heading down a very, very dangerous road where we start to say some groups are more have inherently more worth and more value than others. No, we need to really, I think we can say this very comfortably in America, where or at least our Constitution or our systems are predicated on this belief that all people are equal, no matter what, irrespective of, and I mean equal in value, right? Think back to Harrison Bergeron, right? I mean equal in value, fundamentally, because we are human beings, we are fundamentally worthy of something. And our race, our intellect, our physical abilities, our looks, all this kind of stuff does not matter as much as our inherent value as human beings. If we forget that, if we aren't aware of that inherent dignity, which you see it in the New Testament, you see it in the Old Testament. If you don't want to be religious, fine, but it's very clearly a teaching that's there, and then we see it very clearly here in America as well, and in the Western world generally as well. Whatever, I don't really care about the geography of it, but just the idea that we all have inherent value as human beings, east, west, north, south, whatever. If we forget this, I think that just inherently opens the door to a lot of these atrocities, okay? And then finally, I think something we really need to be careful of is a feature that we saw both in Nazism and I think, as George Orwell very rightly points out, we see in communism and Marxism as well, is this idea of resentment, of hatred of other groups. George Orwell famously said, or famously argued, communism and Marxism doesn't love the poor as much as it hates the rich, right? It has found a group that it really has animosity towards. I think that's what is going on, and what is one of the major dysfunctions in something like Marxism and in Nazism, obviously, right? So hatred of groups, okay, division, kind of like tribalism. It's you and us versus each other, all this kind of stuff. That's one thing we need to be careful of in the future and in the present. And we also need to be careful of dehumanization, forgetting the inherent dignity of human life, okay? No matter your race, no matter your age, any of this crap, okay? Inherent value, universal value of all human life. And also this belief in utopia and this forgetting about the inherent flaws of human nature. That's a serious problem as well. So all three of those things, guys, I think are things we should take away from the 20th century. And be aware that those things are very, very serious mistakes to make that I think will inevitably lead to something like this again, okay? Now, as we move away from this discussion, talking about the 20th century, it's cool to talk about the literature that is emerging. So let's move now back to our discussion of literature. Now that we have a firm understanding of the history, of the philosophy, and all of the context that we need, let's move into now literature. The dystopian genre emerges around this time. And we know, for example, that works like 1984, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451, Lord of the Flies, all of these, emerge and develop that genre of the dystopian world, warning us against many different things. Obviously, 84 is warning us against the danger of tyranny, the danger of kind of fascistic, tyrannical governments. And also Brave New World and Fahrenheit are warning us of the danger of what I've been talking about a little bit here at this past few moments, about this idea of cultural erosion, the erosion of the belief in human worth and human dignity of life, and the erosion of some kind of camaraderie and this like tribalism idea. All of those texts talk about that to some degree. And then, of course, the forgetting of human nature and this belief in utopia, right? That is very clearly something we see in The Lord of the Flies. Okay. So all of this is where we find our present authors, okay? Solzhenitsyn and Viktor Frankl. So let's take a look. I think I gave you about 2 passages for each of these guys, and I want to go through them in some relative detail, but I'm going to try to move relatively quickly through them because they're not long passages. But let's look at these texts, consider the the insights that we could kind of take from our knowledge now of the 20th century, and then look at these texts with full context and awareness of what they're all about. Okay, so quick summary of the man. Alexander Solzhenitsyn lived through the communist revolution in Russia and served in the Russian army during World War II. After being imprisoned for commenting unfavorably on the government, he spent several years in the Russian Gulag camps, enduring torture, potential execution, severe malnourishment in his multi-volume account of the communist Russian atrocities. He recounts the mass slaughter of over 10 million Ukrainians and the imprisonment, torture, and murder of anyone who dissented from the Marxist communist ideology. It is estimated that under Stalin's communist policies, over 50 million civilians were murdered or starved to death. Okay, so reminding us of our, the atrocities that were surrounding the world this man was living through. Okay, so let's see what he's talking about here. And the passage says, Solzhenitsyn reflects on the atrocity of the 20th century and beyond. So this is after he is out of prison, right? He survived, spoiler alert, he survives the imprisonment in the Gulag. And this is him kind of recounting what he thinks so far. Do such people really exist? And I'm going to actually edit his writing here. He's talking about evil people. Do evil people really exist? We would prefer to say that such people cannot exist, that there aren't any. It is permissible to portray evildoers in a story for children so as to keep the picture simple, okay? Now, let's talk about what he's discussing here. He's talking about, like, look, do evil human beings actually exist? Do people who wish overt malice towards other people actually exist? Well, we see them in, like he says, children's stories. Sure. But they're usually very simplistic in those stories. Fair enough. But when the great world literature of the past, Shakespeare, Schiller, Dickens, inflates images of evildoers of the blackest shades, it seems somewhat farcical and clumsy to our contemporary perception, right? So he's saying evil in the past, evil in our literature rather, looks farcical, looks overly inflated, looks comical almost, especially with what we see as evil here now in the 20th century, okay? The trouble lies in the way these classic evildoers are pictured. They recognize themselves as evildoers, and they know their souls are black, and they reason, I won't live unless I do evil. So I'll set my father against my brother. I'll drink the victim's suffering until I'm drunk with them, all this kind of stuff, okay? Now, and he talks about Iago here and all that kind of stuff, like from Shakespeare's villains. So what's he saying here? He's saying that in the depictions of evil that we see, the villains, right, the antagonists, they see themselves as evil. They know that they're evil, and they lean into it, okay? But he says, no, that's not the way it is. To do evil, a human being must first of all believe that what he is doing is good, or else that it's a well-considered act in conformity with natural law, okay? He needs to what? First believe, he must is a human being must believe that what he's doing is good. Okay. So he's saying, no, these depictions of evil, while I might argue that they are metaphorically, symbolically relevant to their texts, they are fundamentally missing a point. They are not a truly realistic depiction of evil, of an evil person, at least, of an evil human being. An evil human being, first of all, needs to believe whatever evil he's doing is a good thing, and it's conformed with natural law or morality, as we could say. Fortunately, he says, it is in the nature of human beings to seek a justification for their actions. Macbeth's self-justifications were feeble, and his conscience devoured him. Yes, even Iago was a little lamb too. The imagination and the spiritual strength of Shakespeare's evildoers stopped short at a dozen corpses. Okay, so he's saying that when we do evil, or when we do anything, we look for justification. We look for reasons. We look for excuses, right? We look for permission to do things, okay? Macbeth and Iago, yeah, sure. Literary examples. But here he says, the imagination and the spiritual strength of Shakespeare's evildoers stopped short of a couple of dozen corpses. In other words, there weren't real strong depictions of this kind of evil, of people who really understood that who really thought that what they were doing was good. Okay, because they had no ideology, that is what gives evil doing its long sought justification and gives the evildoer the necessary steadfastness and determination. So what is he saying here? It is ideology. It is a belief system. It is a very firmly stuck to belief system that gives people justification to do evil. Okay, that is what the social theory, which helps to make his acts seem good instead of bad in his own and others' eyes, so that he won't hear reproaches and curses, but will receive praise and honors. In other words, he's saying all of the evils that he has been seeing has been done by people who really firmly believe that what they're doing is good and just. Now, you could break down why. He doesn't break down fundamentally why, but it's essentially, I'm sorry, he kind of does, but we could break down the specifics of it. Fundamentally, he's saying that what they're doing is justified to them because they think that they're doing some great good. They're actually kind of doing something positive fundamentally by their evil actions. That is how the agents of the Inquisition fortified their wills, by invoking Christianity. The conquerors of foreign lands by extolling the grandeur of their motherland. The colonizers by civilization. The Nazis by race. The Jacobins, early and late, by equality, the brotherhood, and the happiness of future generations. Okay, so the last two he points out here, he goes through history, right? He says, the Inquisition, the what's it called? The colonizers, etc. But he points out these two races, the Jacobins, right? The kind of stand-in fight, which, by the way, of course, as always, we don't know. Jacobins, who is that? Want the exact kind of definition? Let's take a look. It's just what? Member of a democratic club, especially in the most radical group in the French Revolutions, right? So the revolutionary groups that we saw during the French Revolution, particularly violent at the time, right? So good invocation from him at that point. The Nazis, we of course know quite well, they invoke race. And then the French revolutionaries invoke what? Equality, brotherhood, all this kind of stuff. I think he's very clearly trying to draw a connection here. That's why I had us look this up, because it says early and late. Does he mean that there were later groups of the Jacobins? Yes. But who is he probably also kind of tongue-in-cheek referring to here? Probably communists, okay? Probably people who follow Marxist ideas, these ideas of liberation and universal, equality of classes, and outcomes and all this kind of stuff. Their evils are permitted because they believe what? We need the purification of our civilization and our race. We need the purification and the equality of each other under classes and brotherhood and all this other kind of stuff. That gives us what? The justification to do evil, as he says here. Thanks to ideology, the 20th century was fated to experience evildoing on a scale calculated in the millions. This cannot be denied, nor passed over, nor suppressed. So in other words, The atrocities that we just discussed were done because of what people believed. People believed ideas and believed them so firmly and so twistedly that that is what they were able to, that they, allowed themselves, or that it helped push themselves into doing these evil actions. Now, I think it's worth saying, of course, that their ideologies that they were believing were deeply wrong and deeply fundamentally false. We talked about this with these ideas of utopia, with these ideas that deny human nature, that deny human virtue, all of this kind of stuff, and these ideologies that ferment hatred and resentment. All of these things are what lead to the evil that Solzhenitsyn is describing. How then do we dare insist that evildoers do not exist? And who was it that destroyed these millions? That is, the millions in the 20th century. Without evildoers, there would have been no archipelago. Okay? In other words, without evil people, as he has defined them, there would be none of this, right? We wouldn't be talking about this. I wouldn't be in prison. I wouldn't have been in prison like he was describing here. Okay. Solzhenitsyn now reflects on the nature of the human heart. Okay, so that's his discussion of evil and why it does exist, right? People that are evil do exist, sure. How about now? How about the human heart? What could I do to make them understand that I was that I was not a spy or saboteur, that I was their friend, that it was because of them that I was here? I smiled, looking up at them. I smiled at them from a column of prisoners under escort. But my bared teeth seemed to them the worst kind of mockery, and they shook their fists and bellowed insults at me even more violently than before. I smiled in pride that I had been arrested not for stealing, nor treason, nor desertion, but because I had discovered through my power of reasoning the evil secrets of Stalin. I smiled at the thought that I wanted and might still be able to effect some small remedies and changes in our Russian way of life. In other words, he's talking about when he was in prison, in the Gulag, and he was trying to separate himself from other human beings around him, other prisoners, by saying, no, I haven't really committed any great evil. I'm not really supposed to be here. I just noticed something that was, wrong with Stalin, and I can, help make the system better, therefore. But all that time, my suitcase was being carried by others, and I didn't even feel remorseful about it. And if my neighbor, whose sunken cheeks were already covered with a soft 2-week growth of beard and whose eyes were filled to overflowing with suffering and knowledge, had then and there reproached me in the clearest of the clearest Russian words for having disgraced the honor of a prisoner by appealing to the convoy for help, and had accused me of haughtiness, of setting myself above the rest of them, I would have not understood him. Okay, he's saying what? I don't even understand the fact that I would not at that point have understood the fact that I was part of the problem, that I was doing an injustice to those around me, that I was among those evil people we just discussed above. I simply would not have understood what he was talking about. I was an officer. Okay. I was an officer. I was with these people. I was among these people committing these atrocities. And if 7 of us had to die on the way, and the 8 could have been saved by the convoy, what was to keep me from crying out, "Sergeant, save me, I am the officer"? And that's what an officer is, even when his shoulder boards aren't blue. And if they are blue, if he has been indoctrinated to believe that even among other officers, he is the salt of the earth, and that he knows more than others and is entrusted with more responsibility than others, and that consequently it is his duty to force a prisoner's head between his legs and then to shove him like that into a pipe, why shouldn't he? I credited myself with unselfish dedication. Okay, he's saying, Even though I didn't wear that blue band, which is what Stalin's secret police wore, I was a member of the army, I was an officer. Even then, how good was I? You know, I thought myself more important than the humans around me, than my other soldiers around me. Okay. But meanwhile, I had been thoroughly prepared to be an executioner. And if I had gotten into the NKVD school under Yazov, maybe I would have mattered just in time. I'm sorry, maybe I would have matured just in time for Beria. So let the reader who expects this book to be a political expose slam its cover shut now. So what's he saying here? A little bit of historical context here, a little bit more that we touched on, little details here. Beria was the man in charge of Stalin's gulags, basically. He was the one in charge of the secret police, in charge of the NKVD, the people who would essentially be the ones rounding up civilians and putting them in prisons and in gulags and all the rest. Okay. So he's saying here, what? You know, if I was this bad, if I was this kind of easy to twist in the army, how would I have been if I got recruited for the NKVD? Especially if Beria had gotten there. And Beria, of course, made things really, really ugly in the gulags and was a real monster and piece of work. Okay. So let the reader who expects this book to be a political expose slam its cover shut now. In other words, I'm not going to just, slander everyone else. I'm also going to demonstrate what? If only it were so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? During the life of any heart, this line keeps changing place, and sometimes it is squeezed one way by exuberant evil, and sometimes it shifts to allow enough space for good to flourish. Okay. So he's saying, in not so many words here, guys, that he was responsible for the evils he's going to be discussing, at least in part, by being the same sort of gullible, easily manipulatable, ignorant, lazy, and even malicious people that we all are. Okay. He is a human. He has human nature, and thus he has this flawed nature that he's discussing here. Okay, so it's not an expose. It's not him pointing the finger only at the people who perpetrated this. It's also him pointing the finger at himself. And I think also, therefore, all of us for allowing this evil to flourish, okay? Because we are what? We think that there's no evil where? Inside of our own hearts, right? Those errors that we just discussed in the 20th century, like the Lord of the Flies, really, really drills home, are our errors. They are our problems. This is one of the things that's so uncomfortable that people really, really twist themselves up in knots to kind of misunderstand it. The 20th century was committed by us in many ways. It's not committed by a bunch of deranged, mentally ill people. It is us. It's human beings that were kind of manipulated or willfully blinding themselves into doing these things, or just expressing their nature, part of their nature at the very least. Okay. He's saying it's us, it's human beings that do these things. One and the same human being is, at various ages, under various circumstances, a totally different human being. At times, he is close to being a devil, at times, sainthood, but his name doesn't change. And to that name, we ascribe the whole lot, good and evil. Socrates taught us, know thyself. Okay? Know that you are good and evil. Know that you have these flaws in you. Know that you have a propensity to be, duped into believing in a utopia, that you have the propensity to be sucked into and tempted by resentment of other people. Know that you have a temptation, that you could have a temptation and ignorance of denying human worth and human value, and then become someone like a Nazi or someone like a communist executioner. Okay. So deep stuff, of course, as always. Now for the questions here. Articulate to the best of your abilities what a major theme of this author's work is. What is it that Solzhenitsyn is trying to communicate to us? And again, if we're struggling communicating themes, think of some of the ideas he's focusing on here, and then kind of extract what are his teachings, therefore. What is he teaching? What is he saying about those things? That's kind of what the theme is. So what are the themes here? Good and evil, right? Good. Let's focus on evil particularly, right? In both of these passages. Evil, he's very clearly focusing on evil, but he's also focusing on human nature, okay? So human nature and evil. Consider, what is he saying about evil? We've kind of discussed this already. I'm going to leave it kind of open to you, but consider whether or not what is his characterization of evil like? How is evil characterized? What does it behave like? And where do we find it? And then consider, for example, with human nature, what does he say human beings are like, through discussing himself and through kind of reflecting on what he has experienced and what the 20th century entailed. And then, of course, which techniques is he using to do this? I'll tell you what I noticed right off the bat. I notice allusions, right? I notice he's alluding to human history. I notice he's alluding to literature. He's alluding to even ancient literature at times. That's clearly a point that I think he's doing. And he's also using pretty clear imagery, right? He's using quite a lot of imagery, especially in that second passage, with this idea of the line between good and evil, light and darkness, all this kind of stuff, okay? And he's also using kind of flashbacks, right? What he remembers. He's using, if you want, kind of rhetorical devices like back and forth with himself, discussing things with, the prisoner or even with himself, all of this sort of stuff. And he's, of course, using first person point of view in some sense, okay? So that is just a brief look at Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. I hope that you do read it, even if it's abbreviated or it's a abridged version at some point in the future, okay? Now, I like to read Frankl after Solzhenitsyn, okay? Because Solzhenitsyn really very much expresses the overwhelming existential horror of what we have seen in the 20th century, okay? And after our talk of the 20th century, after our clear discussion of what some of the main lessons are from it, what we want to avoid in the 20th century, after reflecting on Solzhenitsyn's reflections, I like to end with Viktor Frankl, okay? And you'll see why in a moment. First of all, who is he? Who's this man? He began his career as a Jewish psychologist in Germany before the 1930s, where he specialized in treating patients with depression and anxiety and suicidality. Under the Nazi Party's persecution, he and his family were placed in death camps, wherein his wife and his parents died. He survived the Nazis' extermination of over 10 million people and went on to develop his theory of logotherapy, a school of psychology that focuses on helping people find meaning in their lives and even in the face of extreme hardships and despair, okay? Under the implementation of his practice, the Academy of Vienna, that is in Europe, reduced their students' suicide rate to 0%, okay? Now, a couple things here. So, where the Gulag Archipelago is a cataloging of what Solzhenitsyn experienced, saw, and learned about himself and about communism and human nature. Man's search for meaning is the same thing in some sense, but more internal, more kind of personal. This is a narrative and a sort of theory book that Viktor Frankl puts forward to try to help people endure the inherent sufferings of life, not just the extreme situation of Auschwitz and death camps and all this kind of stuff, but also in just everyday life, in the sense of meaninglessness, in the sense of nihilism around them, okay? Let's take a look at Frankl's experience. The first passage is where he's remembering his wife while in Auschwitz, okay? We stumbled on in the darkness, over big stones and through large puddles. along the one road leading from the camp. The accompanying guards kept shouting at us and driving us with butts of their rifles. Anyone with very sore feet supported himself on his neighbor's arm. Hardly a word was spoken. The icy wind did not encourage talk. Hiding his mouth behind his upturned collar, the man marching next to me whispered suddenly, "If our wives could see us now, I do hope they are better off in their camps and don't know what is happening to us." Okay. So what's the image that Frankl presents us with here? The image, the situation of people in Auschwitz in a death camp, walking in bitter cold, probably with barely any clothes on, probably barefoot. So this is an image, guys, of just abject suffering, okay? I encourage students, as much as is healthy, to imagine this and to experience snippets of it if they can. Go stand in the cold for a little while, walk around in the cold, and place your mind here, touch your foot to stones and, do little things like this to try to just imagine what this would have felt like and how much suffering these guys were going through. And then, extrapolate that to multiple days, multiple months, multiple years, okay? So his prisoner next to him says, "If only our wives could see us, I really hope that they are better off," okay? Very noble and very romantic sentiment that you'll usually find in a loved one, right? I hope that at least my wife, my husband, is better off than me. That brought thoughts of my own wife to mind. And as we stumbled on for miles, slipping on icy spots, supporting each other time and again, dragging one another up and onward, nothing was said. But we both knew each of us was thinking of his wife. Occasionally, I looked at the sky. There were stars, where the stars were fading, and the pink light of the morning was beginning to spread behind a dark bank of clouds. Okay? So he's thinking of his wife, this woman he loves more than anyone in the world, and he's going through this immense situation of suffering, okay? But my mind clung to my wife's image, imagining it with uncanny acuteness. I heard her answering me, saw her smile, her frank and encouraging look. Real or not, her look was then more luminous than the sun, which was beginning to rise. A thought transfixed me. The first time in my life, I saw the truth as it is set into song by so many poets, proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers. What is this truth? The truth that love is the ultimate and highest goal to which man can aspire. So, what is he realizing here? He's realizing the purpose of life, guys and gals. He's realizing where an ultimate source of meaning can be found in life. He says, "Then I grasped the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought and belief have to impart." In other words, the greatest thing you'll ever learn. The salvation of man is through love and in love. I understand how a man who has nothing left in the world still may know bliss, be it only for a brief moment in the contemplation of his beloved. In a position of utter desolation, when man cannot express himself in positive action, when his only achievement may consist in enduring his suffering in the right way, an honorable way, in such a position, man can, through loving contemplation of the image he carries of his beloved, achieve fulfillment. Okay, so he's saying, first and foremost, guys, the thing that I usually have written on my board and that I've talked about in that first video of the year, which is what? The idea that love and to be loved in return, right, is the greatest truth that we could ever learn. Now, he, of course, articulates it this way, that the salvation of man, in other words, are the thing that will save us, the thing that is greatest for us, the greatest bliss, the greatest purpose is to love and to be in love. Okay. So he says all this, and he says that even in this horrible situation, when there's nothing to do except suffer, but suffer rightly, suffer in an honorable way, a man can achieve fulfillment. For the first time in my life, I was able to understand the meaning of the words, "The angels are lost in perpetual contemplation of infinite glory." In front of me, a man stood, and those following him fell on top of him. Guard rushed over and used his whip on them all. Thus my thoughts were interrupted for a few minutes. But soon my soul found its way back to the prisoner's existence, to another world, from the prisoner's existence to another world, and I resumed talk with my loved one. I asked her questions, and she answered. She questioned me in return, and I answered. Okay, so it is in love that he's able to transcend all the suffering of the world, right? And keep in mind, this is not some Hallmark postcard, of, I'm having a bad day, my work's not going well, No, this is like utmost suffering that this guy is going through. Very few levels deeper, right? And he's still able to find meaning and fulfillment. Okay. So last passage here for the day. Frankel expresses his search for meaning while traveling to a new concentration camp. So similar sort of passage here. As the inner life of the prisoner tended to become more intense, he also experienced the beauty of art and nature as never before. Under their influence, he sometimes even forgot his own frightful circumstances. If someone had seen our faces on the journey from Auschwitz to a Bavarian camp, as we beheld the mountains of Salzburg with their summits glowing in the sunset through the little barred windows of the prison carriage, he would never have believed that those were faces of men who had given up all hope of life and liberty. Despite that factor, or maybe because of it, we were carried away by nature's beauty, which we had missed for so long. Okay, so he's showing us here that alongside love, with love, or is it the same thing? The beauty that he's able to experience in art and in the world around him, which he could not focus or could not totally comprehend before. Now he sees the beauty of it, and it again helps him transcend this suffering. So it's in beauty/love that we're able to endure this suffering of the world. And apparently he needed to be put in a situation like this, or something about this situation has helped him see this beauty that he hadn't seen before, maybe. He goes on, in Camp 2, a man might draw the attention of a comrade working next to him to a nice view of the setting sun shining through the tall trees of the Bavarian woods, as in the famous watercolor of Dürer, the same woods in which he had built an enormous hidden munitions plant. One evening, when we were already resting on the floor of our hut, dead tired, soup bowls in hand, a fellow prisoner rushed in and asked us to run out to the assembly grounds and see the wonderful sunset. Standing outside, we saw sinister clouds glowing in the west, and the whole sky alive with clouds of ever-changing shapes and colors, from steel blue to blood red. The desolate gray mud huts provided a sharp contrast, while the puddles on the muddy ground reflected the glowing sky. Then, after minutes of moving silence, one prisoner said to another, "How beautiful the world could be." Okay? Now so main point here. Frankel is experiencing once again the beauty of the world all around him. That seems to, in the imagery that he's describing, seems to transcend, like literally and ontologically, the suffering that he is enduring. Like his suffering is like this little mud hut that is surrounded by beauty and overshadowed, dominated by beauty. It reminds me personally of the Lord of the Rings scene, as everything does, of when our main characters are in Mordor, which this is, right? This is effectively Mordor. And yet they see a star above them and they realize that there's beauty up there. There's something beautiful and transcendent and good about the world that this present evil and suffering just cannot touch. It has no power over it. It's a very, very interesting scene, to say the least. Okay. I was going to say that I kind of understand a little bit of what he's talking about because I was privileged enough to go to Auschwitz and see the grounds there, and the countryside surrounding Auschwitzen, as the Germans would call it, is gorgeous, is absolutely beautiful. And even when you're standing in the former concentration camps, and looking at the former death camps, I should say, and looking at the remains of innocent murdered people all around you, there's still beauty everywhere around you. It's so strange. It's a very strange contrast. So I kind of understand this, and I encourage you again always, if you have the opportunity, definitely go see these places that we talk about in literature. If you have the opportunity, go experience it in real life. Okay. Finally, another time we were at work in a trench. The dawn was gray around us, gray as the sky, gray was the sky above, gray the snow and the pale light of the dawn, gray the rags in which the fellow prisoners were clad, and gray their faces. I was again conversing silently with my wife, or perhaps I was struggling to find the reason for my sufferings, my slow dying. In a last violent protest against the hopelessness of imminent death, I sensed my spirit piercing through the enveloping gloom. I felt it transcend the hopeless, meaningless world. And from somewhere, I heard a victorious yes, an answer to my question of the existence of an ultimate purpose. At that moment, a light was lit in a distant farmhouse, which stood on the horizon as if painted there in the midst of a miserable gray of a dawning morning in Bavaria. Et lux in tenebris lucet, and the light shineth in the darkness. Okay. So what does he understand here? So now that beauty is kind of, away for the moment, right? It's overshadowed by the grayness. He's sitting here once again, kind of in that hole of suffering that the 20th century has put him in, has placed him in and produced. And he is contemplating the question that we talked about at the beginning of the 20th century. Is there good and evil? Is there truly meaning to this world? Is there a reason, rationality, a purpose to human life? And all this kind of stuff, right? That stuff that we saw the 20th century starting to move away from, or at least in some ideological form, kind of removing itself from. And to him, the answer comes, yes, yes, there is, okay? And he quotes, I think it's the Gospel of John in Latin, and light shineth in darkness, right? Which we just read in our last section of class, okay? Or last two sections of class. All right. So what is the major theme of Viktor Frankl's work? Well, what are the ideas that he's focusing on? Suffering, meaning, love, and beauty. Okay, those I think are his major ideas. What is he saying about them? When it comes to suffering, he seems to be of no delusions, ladies and gents. He is saying life includes suffering, right? He doesn't go into the whole discussion as to why and all that kind of stuff here, at least, like Solzhenitsyn does. He's like, I'm suffering. I'm in the situation. I'm a prisoner. I'm a victim of all the things of reality around me. Absolutely. Okay. Is there a way to transcend it? Yes, he says so. He talks about love, right? Love, selfless love for life, for people, for those who he is actually connected with, right? Not like an abstract idea, not like, humanity, right? Or my countrymen, none of this crap. Like a specific person he is in love with, and he spreads that to those around him as well. Now, beauty, the power of beauty, the transcendent power of beauty to reveal to us what? The reasons for suffering, right? The strength to endure suffering, the love that we need to embody or we need to kind of find all around us, the power of beauty to what? To reveal the purpose of life, right? To kind of demonstrate the purpose of life to us, that there is an ultimate purpose to life. All these things could qualify as a theme here. So pick which one you want, okay? Now, which techniques does he employ here? I think it's pretty clear right off the bat. He really, really likes imagery, okay? He is overflowing with imagery, absolutely. And it's beautiful. It's very, very well done, very authentic, okay? He also focuses a lot on illusions, right? He drops a couple of illusions in there. He drops conflict, right? There's a lot of conflict here. He also sets up some rhetorical devices, right? He really kind of leans into his payoff, right? At the end, he really kind of like sets up questions that he wants to answer and that he's struggling with, you know, and his point of view, you know, shines through quite a bit there. Okay, so guys and gals, we end our discussion about the 20th century nonfiction literature with Man's Search for Meaning. I hope that you take away not just the history, but also some of the warning signs we need to be aware of, some of the things we need to remember from the 20th century so that we can try to steer ourselves in a more positive direction. I hope that I've at least encouraged you to learn more about Solzhenitsyn's experience and what happened in the systems that he had to live through. And I hope I've definitely encouraged you to read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which really, really has helped a lot of people discover, not invent, but discover the meaning in their life and the purpose of life, okay? So that is the end of our little excursus on nonfiction literature. Next time, we're going to move into fiction once again, but with another piece of 20th century literature in the form of the American short story, A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor, okay? In the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day and a very meaningful and happy life, okay? Until then, I will see you next time. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.